Hi, I'm Jess. Today we're opening up on ceremony for enthusiasts, iconoclasts, anarchists, and you. I'm going to explain to you listeners exactly what happened and exactly the conversation I've just had with Amy about why she's here and why we're having this conversation with you. So the other day, I was trying to write my website and I was having thoughts about what do I say? What kind of words do I use? Now, in the funeral industry, and I use that term loosely, it's really common among death educators to insist upon the use of the word death, dying, even deceased, dead. And there's real snobbery around the terms past, passing away, moved on, no longer with us, sleeping, rainbow bridges, all of that. And I got to thinking, having been really quite sanctimonious about it myself for the most of my career, which is since 2013. And before that, actually, when I was 25, I worked in a hospice and it was all very, very clear. We talk about death, we talk about dying, we use these words, and anything else is just considered a little bit lowbrow. But the more I spoke to my customers and the more I listened, the more I heard people using the term past away, passed on, and all the things that I just outlined. So I became really interested in the whole field of euphemism and what euphemism does for us. Why do we have to talk about things in such a sort of circumvent things that we find difficult? And is that actually quite a useful device and quite an interesting thing to do? So I sat down with this very, very niche area of interest and said to my friend, I desperately want to find a linguist. I want to go to the universities. I want to find someone who's a specialist in this kind of language, euphemistic language around death and how we use death and language to talk about death and what does it all mean. And I had no idea where I was going to start. I was thinking like Oxford University or Cambridge or something. And then the next day I met Amy, who has done loads of research. She's a copywriter. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that. And language is her passion. She works in death and dying and funerals, and she's a copywriter, and all of her interest is exactly the conversation that I was having, that the person I was looking for. So she turned up in my life, and that's the background to that. And this is her first podcast, so I'm excited. I'm just delighted that she's here, but I'm going to let you all know why I'm excited that she's here and just read out some words, her own words. Poor thing had to say her own thing about herself, which is always really difficult. So Amy Dugmore is the content director for Funeral Choice, and this is the UK's leading funeral comparison and advice platform. Many of you might not even have known that was a thing. I certainly didn't know that was a thing. I'm very pleased that it is a thing. She has had a varied career producing content for higher education, automotive and fashion retail, among many other sectors, as well as co-producing workshops with Google. She also volunteers as a mentor, helping young people break into digital marketing and content creation. Now, I should tell you, everybody, I'm in my new studio. I'm really excited about it. Having all of those of you who've been on this journey with me will know that we have Rupert and Seymour and Myrtle, the Burmese cats, joining in from time to time. Having shut them out, I actually have a space with a door. I now find that the seagulls are vociferously, that's a good word, Amy, we'll enjoy that one later, and they're busy joining in as well. So if you hear a strange whining sound, it's either a Burmese cat or a seagull, but it's not my partner. So that was a seagull, I think. As a copywriter by trade, language has always been at the forefront of Amy's work. And she was telling me just now that even as a young person, it was really, really key to her, and it's a fascination. And she's passionate about the ways in which language shapes our experiences and helps us to find connection. And I'm excited to hear a bit more about that in relation to trauma, which is an area I've not touched on before. It is safe to say that when she started out, she was not expecting to find herself specialising in the death care sector, but she has discovered a passion for compassionate content and helping people to join and to plan the funeral they really want. Compassionate content sounds fascinating. So what we're going to do, everyone, is just enter into this conversation with the freedom, the free-spiritedness that we always do. And if we go off on tangents, we will. I'm just going to take these glasses off. For those of you that can't see me, I've got my fabulous bright big glasses on. They're a little bit smudgy and I can't quite see because my new studio is full of light. So that's Amy. Now, I'm absolutely beside myself with excitement that she's here. I mean, I love all of my guests and I'm always excited and it's always genuine. So those of you who are listening to me will be thinking, oh, she's always excited, but she really is excited because this is a niche area. This is an area that many of you won't have thought about because you won't have had to create websites for people, perhaps all over the world, who all have different ways of talking about death. You won't have had to think about culturally specific language around death and dying. And it won't have occurred to you that there are so many different ways of doing that, that there's a hierarchy of words, that are like linguistic semantics. They're all so fascinating. So I've got a few questions that I might or might not ask Amy, depending on how much time we have left when we get going. But I'd just like to welcome you on, Amy. Having introduced you myself, is there anything you'd like to say before we get going?
Thank you. No, I'm super excited to be here and to chat with you today, Jess. I think you did a fab job of introducing me, so I won't say too much more about that. But yeah, just super excited to jump into the conversation, really.
Okay, well, let's start with one of my big questions, which is what is the best experience of a ceremony that you have ever had?
Yeah, I think for me, actually, it was a friend's wedding that they had a few years ago, and they had a fabulous festival-themed wedding. So they decided not to go down the traditional route. They had access to some grounds. We could all bring tents. It was super relaxed. It was very much do what you want to do. So there was no dress code. So there were people there in sportswear. There were people there in glitter and wings. It was a fabulous, really nice way of bringing everyone together. And I think for me, as someone who's never been married, I thought I could do this. This is really, really nice in terms of a comfortable way of doing it. Everyone was just, enjoying themselves and doing it their own way, which I thought was really beautiful. So stand out for me, I think.
Interesting, the glitter connection.
Exactly,
I did beautiful, beautiful funeral once for this gorgeous lady she's called Zena. I'm allowed to share that. She's called Zena. She was a big personality. She loved a nightclub. She loved dub music. And she had a parrot called Sparky. And I remember her vividly. And if any of you go on my social media, you'll see some photographs of some wooden angel wings that were created by her friends. She turned up on a flatbed truck. And I was requested to wear a sequin dress with disco balls around my neck for the funeral. And I led the funeral like that. And she was a festival goer, so I can relate to that. And can you think of any ceremonies that you've been to that you really wouldn't want to attend again?
Oh, I think, I suppose at the other end of the spectrum, I think probably the most disappointing ceremony I think I went to was many years ago now, but for the funeral of an elderly relative. And I think in complete contrast to that wedding, which was so fabulous and so personalised, it was the complete opposite. And we had it in a church, and the vicar clearly didn't know the person who died. And to this day, I couldn't tell you why we had it in a church, because she wasn't religious. We weren't religious. We were all there singing hymns we didn't know. And it just felt very odd. And in hindsight, why did we do that? And I think probably the answer is it was at the time what you do. And we didn't question that. And we just went, well, this is what a funeral looks like. So we'll get a vicar, we'll get a church. We'll sing some hymns that, no one knows. And it was just a strange experience, I suppose. It felt more like we were doing the formalities than really celebrating the person. And we could have celebrated that person, I think, differently if we'd perhaps kind of thought differently about it and been aware of our options. I think would have been a big thing.
Do you think that was that? And was that a long time ago?
Yeah, I mean, it's going back 15 years ago now. Yeah. So, and I was much younger and, didn't know anything about funerals. It was, I think, the second funeral I'd ever been to. So didn't really have much of a baseline as to what to expect with a funeral, which I think is common to a lot of people, isn't it? I think when you get into that situation and you kind of go, well, I'm here doing this must be what we do, rather than think, oh, could it be different and what might it look like?
And I think it is still a really common experience, which is where you come in, actually. And we should perhaps elaborate a little bit about funeral choice, because you're here really... We met through funeral choice, didn't we? And it'd be quite interesting to just expand this idea a little bit further, because so many people still, 15 years on from then, will be just, like those of you out here who are listening. Some of you will have had that experience where you found yourself singing All Things Bright and Beautiful, or
The old rugged cross.
The old rugged cross. So that's quite an interest. That's got an amazing history, that hymn. That's a big Protestant hymn. It's a big hymn in the Jamaican community. So that's interesting, because you wouldn't expect that. Was it a Church of England funeral?
It was, yeah.
So it's really culturally specific as well. So you would choose that for very, very particular people who knew it really well and for whom it had resonance. So that really makes no sense whatsoever. Had it been Amazing Grace, I might have understood it more. So those of you out there who are thinking, yeah, that happened to me, didn't know the hymn, it was really embarrassing. There were not many people there, and we were singing along really weedily. It was awful. That is what funeral choice is for, in a way. It's to prevent you at the last minute finding yourself arranging a funeral and not knowing what else to do, and just being told, this is what we do. We go to church and we sing songs we don't know, and we don't learn anything about the person, and the person that leads it knows nothing about the person who died. So tell us a little bit about the ways in which funeral choice addresses that concern in our contemporary society.
Yeah, of course. And I think that the big clue here is choice, and it's what we stand for. It's very much about, we know the right funeral is different for each and every person. It's going to be a different experience. It's going to look and feel different. And that might be something very traditional for some people. For others, it will be something very different. It might be a natural burial. It might be something very creative, very personal. And we're big believers in making sure people have the information they need to do that. Because I think one of the big reasons that people don't end up having perhaps the funeral they want is they don't realize they can. They don't realize, like the situation I found myself in many years ago, not knowing that, well, what are the choices? And actually the choices are huge and they're varied, and you could do pretty much anything. You just need to know what the options are. And I think, unfortunately, most people, when we get to the point of planning a funeral, we're in a place where we're maybe not that clear in our heads. We're probably not thought about it before for most of us. And suddenly we've got quite a tight timeline, 2, 3, maybe 4 weeks to think about, how do we plan, a whole ceremony with lots of moving parts and lots of specialized language that we've not come across before. So actually for us at Funeral Choice, we try to make sure people have as much of that information as possible by making it freely available. And it comes down, I would say, into 3 core areas really that we try to address. One of which is, as you mentioned at the start, Jess, we are a funeral comparison platform. So we list every funeral director in the UK. So you can go in and see where you're based, who are all the options for you. So, if you want a big name, you can choose a big name. If you want a small independent that's family run, you can do that, but you can see all your options there, which is one area. We also have lots of advice. So, we are really committed to working with experts like you, like Geeta, various funeral directors, to shape our content and make sure we're covering all the topics that people want. So I know we've just collaborated on a piece around writing your own eulogy, which lots of people won't know is an option. So actually it's about, let's get all those options out there. Let's show the full range of funerals and the diverse options that are available through that information. So you can go, well, actually, if I do want a natural burial, what do I need to think about? What are the questions I need to go to a funeral director and ask to make that happen? Because I think that's really, really important. And then the third area, I think, just talking more about that kind of diversity aspect, is we're really committed to showing what real funerals look like. So we have a big project at the moment where we're sharing stories about real funerals from across the UK, and we've been incredibly lucky. Some really generous, wonderful people have shared the stories of the funerals they've planned. And it's all about showing how different they are. We've had people tell stories about budget funerals, which is often something people don't want to talk about, but is hugely important, is an option for some people, or a necessity. We have people sharing stories about faith funerals and how they've maybe navigated having a traditional faith funeral in the UK, where maybe their faith isn't fully catered to in terms of the traditions that they would normally have followed. And we've got all sorts of things. We've got rainbow coffins, champagne receptions, huge diverse range of stories already and growing. And I think it's really important that we show people that, so that you can actually say, oh, I didn't know I could do that. Or that's really cool. Oh, I can have vodka shots at the end of a funeral. Yes, you can, if that's what you want to do and it feels appropriate. So So yeah, just hugely passionate about sharing how diverse it is.
I am so thrilled to hear you talk about this. I've always wanted to do it and I never really had time. And actually, you had someone on your, it was on Instagram, called Louisa Starr, and she did a ceremony she was talking about. And we trained together and I hadn't heard from her for ages. So we hooked up again after that as to how you're doing. And she was doing really well, but she's wonderful. So it's nice to know that she's still out there doing that. And then when you said about the shots, I did a ceremony for a really young man, far too young. I always get the young ones. And he loved Bailey's. So we started the whole thing off with Bailey's shots. We were in a woodland and we all had Bailey's shots before we got going. And yeah, that's absolutely a thing. And the champagne. What's interesting here is you and I have the same problem that we were discussing. Communicating the gap between what we do and what the average person's experience is of this arena. How do we talk from our own experience and knowledge and expertise to a person who has none? I feel that we're both trying to bridge that gap. We are the bridge in a way. We're translating. So you've done a lot of research, as I understand it, around how to do that. Are you able to share a little bit about how you went about the research and what your results were?
Yeah, of course. I think, well, one of the first things I did actually on joining Funeral Choice was look at our what we call tone of voice. So how do we sound in the words we use on our website? And really wanted to look at how we brought that into the modern age, how we made it more relatable and also how we made it more accessible, because I think that's a huge point that I'll probably talk a bit more about in terms of language. So there were various bits of research we did to kind of get to where we are. The first of which was we actually started by testing some copy samples with audiences and saying, well, what do you like? What do you not like? What works for you? What doesn't? And that was interesting because what we found through that is that although logically we all know that when you plan a funeral, you're transacting with a business. You know, a funeral director is a business. You pay them money. Obviously, they make money from that. We understand that. When we come to planning a funeral, we're super uncomfortable with that concept of it being a business. And actually, any kind of hint of anything that feels commercial is something that typically a lot of people feel quite uncomfortable with. And it's one of the reasons we don't talk about cost enough with funerals, and I think is a potential challenge that we need to address, because actually then people are very surprised when they see the cost of a funeral if they've never really explored it before. But I think, yes, that was kind of a really interesting piece that we got out of that, is this like, well, we don't want to feel it's a business. And that's understandable, because actually, you know, it's a very, very personal, very intimate thing that you're doing, you know, and you're asking this person to do, and you probably don't want to feel like they are. For them, it's a transaction. And it absolutely isn't. I will say that, if you know all the funeral directors and celebrants I speak to, you never see it as a transaction. You see it as so much more, and a kind of part of that very personal experience. But it was interesting to see that. And I think, as we were talking about earlier, Jess, for me, one of the challenges that we have, because we're not sort of able to talk to each visitor of our website individually, is how do we find something that reaches everyone, which is tens of thousands of people a month. They've all got different perspectives, different beliefs, different needs, different experiences. And how do we find a way to make our language work for as many people as possible, which is really why I ended up doing this research, is, okay, what can we do that's going to help as many as possible and not alienate people? So we did that piece of research. That went on to a bigger rebrand project. So we didn't just look at our written language and how we sound, we actually looked at our visual language as well, which is another, I think, quite a big challenge for people engaging with funerals, is that we're quite used to seeing the same images, a black hearse, a funeral director in a top hat, probably in front of a church. And even that visual language, I think, can create expectations of what we think a funeral should be. So we wanted to open that up and show more different people, more different scenarios, wicker coffins, painted coffins, woodland burial grounds, and start to think about how we diversify. So that was a big piece of that. But in order to do that, it's a super sensitive audience. You know, we're very, very aware that we're talking to people at one of the most challenging and vulnerable times in their lives. So we were lucky to be able to work with a fantastic research organisation that helped us to speak to bereaved people. And we were actually very, very lucky that they were generous enough to do one-to-one interviews and talk to us about what we were planning to do, how we wanted to sound, how we wanted to look, and how it felt to them, and to make sure that it was really comfortable to them. Because I think for me that I would have hated to have launched something that could have upset people. And we're trying to move into a more positive space, a more open space, but it's quite different from the traditional somber space you expect from funerals. So it was all about getting that balance right. We want to be respectful, but celebratory and welcoming. And how do we do that? And we were incredibly lucky. Like I say, these wonderful bereaved people were generous enough to give their time and their feedback. And it was overwhelmingly positive. And we made some refinements, but we also heard a lot about how, I think one person described it as a warm hug, which to me was just like, yes, that's where we want to be. We want that experience to feel supported and to feel like you're in a place where, you're going to get what you need at a particularly difficult time. But that was the starting point. We don't stop researching. So very recently, we did some research into funeral language specifically. We know most of us don't think about funerals until we need to, but we wanted to know what we do and don't understand about funeral language. And it was interesting. There were some things that were expected, and there were some things that were less expected, I think, certainly for me. So, we found out that 41% of people don't know what a direct cremation is. And that's despite it becoming increasingly popular as an option. Many people, if you say to them, would you be interested? Would you consider a direct cremation? They don't understand what that option is. And it just shows how we need to do a better job of educating people and understanding what those options are in the right way at the right time, which I think is key. We found a few things. So celebration of life was another one. Actually, 38% of people didn't understand what that was, which I find interesting because we know, again, these are key trends. If you talk to anyone in the industry, they'll say celebration of life is on the rise, direct cremation is on the rise. And yet a significant proportion of the general public don't know what they mean. So aren't necessarily going to go into conversations and ask for those options or understand what we're talking about when we present those options, which I think is interesting. And there were other bits, things like, I think the biggest surprise for me was hearses. A third of people don't know what a hearse is. And most commonly, they confused it with the vehicle that you take the family in. So they would think of it as a limo and not realize there's a distinction between the two. So even when we're talking about really, I think what most of us would consider quite core elements of a traditional funeral, lots of people won't understand what that terminology means. If you say, do you want a hearse, or what kind of hearse do you want? They may not even understand fully what they're booking. So I think this is where it's key. We need to get clarity for people.
That is absolutely fascinating. I completely would have thought those things were real current language.
Yeah.
I had no idea, because those are absolutely the ways. So what about words that people use for death, I suppose? One thing I'm really particularly interested in, and this is a debate that's ongoing, I have always been encouraged to use the term not loved ones. So I've always been very, very clear that I wouldn't talk about loved ones. I would talk about your people. And then I worked with someone that was rebranding me, and I was talking with a copywriter and a web designer and looking at keywords and all of these things. And they kept saying loved ones. And I kept saying, don't put loved ones. I don't like it. It's not, you can't assume that they're loved. And my friend said, well, if they're looking on your website and they're looking to do a living wake for them, you can assume that they're loved because they're not being forced to do that. And she said, people just sounds really impersonal. And then another young person said to me, I don't like the term your person because that sounds like romantic. That's like, oh, he's my person. You should use loved ones. Loved ones is something everybody, and these are young people and older people that don't do funerals. It's not their work. And they were saying, well, loved ones is just what you say. That's okay. What's wrong with using something that everybody says? And I said, oh, but it's just such a cliche, and it's making assumptions, and it's just a bit Clinton cards, I suppose. It's a bit kind of, pre-written gift card, greeting card. Being a snob about it. And they were all like, but loved ones is what we understand. Loved ones is what we know, and we love them. So that's the word that you use for a dead person when you're dealing with a funeral. That's the word we're using, Jess. So why can't we use that? So we had a real debate about it. And I did capitulate because I realised it was true. And then I did a lot of market research myself, and I had a conversation with a woman who was 23. And obviously it's regional as well, isn't it? But this woman, she was from the north, she was living in Brighton. And I said, well, I was literally sat outside a shop talking to complete strangers in a Brighton context, which is quite an open-minded place in the Brighton lanes. And I was doing research by saying to people, would you like a goodie bag? I'm just promoting my work, and this is what I do. And I said to this young woman, well, how do I open these conversations? I can't just talk about funerals or dead people. And she said, no, don't do that. She said, don't do that. She said, why don't you say legacy? Or have you thought about how you want to be remembered? Or have you thought about your legacy? Should I be really comfortable with that? But if you said death or funeral, I'd run a mile. I hadn't ever thought of that. I'd never thought about death, or I don't know. I just was really, really surprised that she thought legacy and remembering was more of a relatable word than funeral. Have you come across anything like that in your studies?
Yeah, I suppose it's really interesting, actually. I'm nodding away for a few reasons here. I think loved one is a really interesting one. And I think it's an interesting cliche, because I think traditionally when you work in marketing, when you're in copywriting, the kind of the line normally is avoid cliche, because it's tired, it's old, and you're not bringing anything fresh. You need to be creative. And I think for me, one of the things I've always said, even before working in the funeral industry, is cliches exist for a reason. So if you understand the reason and the reason is appropriate, it can still be the right word to use or the right phrase to use. And I think when we think about funerals and we think about death and dying particularly, cliches are really helpful sometimes because they have familiar language and people are coming into a strange space doing things they don't normally do. And it's really helpful if we use language that's reassuring to them that they recognize. So as your research showed, lots of people do use loved one. We use loved one. Our kind of guidance on that with our style is we will use it in context and sparingly. So, I've certainly seen examples where there's so many loved ones on a page, when I've kind of done my own research, it feels overwhelming. But an acknowledgement of that special relationship when, we can't say your mum, your dad, whoever, because we're talking to tens of thousands of people, it's a good way of getting around that. But we will use it, like I say, in context. So, we have information about what happens when someone dies without family. Obviously, it's completely inappropriate in that context to talk about a loved one, or, general information about what to do when someone has just died, because actually that might not be someone you're close to, might not be a loved one. And I think it is, like you say, not making assumptions and giving people space to feel comfortable that whatever their situation is, that's fine. That's their situation, and we accept it. We don't make those assumptions, which I think, you mentioned compassionate content at the start. I think that is really the kind of the core tenet of that, is not to make assumptions and go with what people want. I think is a big one. Just remind me the second thing you mentioned. There was another phrase.
What was it? Loved ones and funeral. So she said,
the death dying
legacy.
piece.
Yeah, she said use the term legacy, or how would you like to be remembered, or what would you like your legacy to be, was what she suggested, and it worked.
Yes, no, that is an interesting one, and we've done some sort of parallel research that kind of relates to this and might explain, I think, the answer you got from the 23-year-old you spoke to. So we've recently looked at whether people are interested in living funerals, for example, and actually really popular among younger generations. So actually, I think there's probably more of an awareness there of thinking about a legacy. I think we see a lot of this now with social media posts. When someone dies, quite often they've pre-written something to go out after their death. And I think young people are a lot more aware of that. And I suspect is why they're perhaps more keen to think, actually, I'm thinking about my legacy and how that might look. I think we do use death and dying. We use those words in spaces where that is the immediate situation that people are dealing with. So an awful lot of people who come to our website, someone has very recently died. And I think when you're in that space, that language is often more acceptable because it is your reality. And I kind of think back to 2 years ago, actually, someone I was very close to had cancer, completely out of the blue, surprise diagnosis. But what was really interesting was the 50-50 split between people who could say cancer and people who couldn't say it. And it was very much the people who'd been through a cancer experience could use the words. And when you're in that situation, it's the right word because that's the reality. And I think it's a similar thing with death and dying. For a lot of people who have just experienced the death of a loved one, that's the word they need to help them navigate some of that space. And I think also, you mentioned euphemism earlier. Euphemisms obviously can soften things sometimes, but they can also sometimes obscure meaning. And I think particularly when we think about the fact that death can happen to anyone can find themselves needing to plan a funeral. And when we think about things like, literacy level, for example, it's something like 7.1 million UK adults have a reading age of 9 years old or lower. So if we start to use euphemisms in that space, we're obscuring meaning. And actually, it's more important we're really clear. And actually, if someone has died, that phrase is much more understandable to far more people. And I think likewise, when we look at people who speak English as a second language, even if they are very strong English language speakers, in that moment when you're going through planning a funeral, we all know that our cognitive function, the way we think, how clearly we think, can be affected. So actually, if we start to hide meaning with euphemisms, although it can be well intended, can potentially be confusing for people. Actually, we need to be really clear in certain spaces. But I think that's written, information. I think when you're face to face and you're having your conversations, you can tailor your language to that person, their understanding and what they're comfortable with. But in a kind of a broader space where we can't sort of say, I'm talking to this person or this person, clarity's got to come first, I think, is the most important thing.
How brilliant. I mean, all of it contextual. And this is, if you're listening out there, you can see how complex this space is. I hadn't really thought about it. When you're one-to-one, you can absolutely tell whether a person is going to go down the death and dying route or the lost and passed away road. For me, both are okay because both are what you need in that moment. And you have the same philosophy. What do you need as an individual? And when you're online, you can't really do that in published materials. And I hadn't really seen that distinction before. Two things come up for me. First is what you said about young people. So I have hired a lot of people. I'm working with a lot of younger people, partly because I'm drawn to them, partly because they're drawn to me. And I am actually 52, but I have a lot of people that come to me who their children have died. Sometimes they've died, and that's something else we'll come up to, death of despair and suicide. We'll come back to that. But I have a lot of people who come to me who have died from despair, younger people, 17 to maybe 25. So I am actually being approached by parents saying he was really colourful, he was a bit of a live wire, he was a bit of a firefly, and we want you because you're colourful and you're young. They had a kind of young vibe. And one of the funeral directors I worked with said the same thing. So one has to be oneself in one's work. So I didn't try and be anything else. And I just found I was drawn to those people to work with me in my designing my marketing. And I was drawn to those people in terms of who I want to work with. So the people that have done my website and the people that have done my copywriting, the people I'm working with are all in their 20s, I've found out. I just suddenly realised. And they, similarly to the things that you're saying, they were quite concerned about not looking too jolly. They said that this is quite a sad thing. You don't want to be looking too circus and too jolly. I separated my weddings from my funerals because I realised quite early on that although it's a lot more work, describing a funeral and describing a wedding, and if you care about language, you just can't do the same thing in the same place. But there was a little bit of a residual wedding-y vibe to what I was doing. And the young woman that helped me with it, she said that the font, the visual stuff that you're talking about, the visual language, the font looks too circus. It looks as though you're doing something that you're being kind of irreverent, but not in a good way. But at the same time, what I offer is quite irreverent. So she had to strike a balance between not being too jovial and not being too dour. So that's the one thing. So I think you're right. And the young people were the people that were really into the legacy, the remembering, the living wakes, which is my specialism, as those of you who know me will be aware. And so that is a younger crowd. And that really interests me because I'd picked it up, but I really hadn't got the extensive research that you've got. So that's one thing. The other thing that I'm thinking around now is this euphemistic business and how it obscures and also softens. So lost is something I'd like to ask you about. I've heard a lot of people say, husband died. Everyone kept saying I'd lost him. I hadn't bloody lost him. He was not lost to me. I hadn't just left him somewhere and he got lost. He died. So there's an anger to that word. And then there are other people for whom I worked as a mentor, as an academy training people to be funeral celebrants, and we had a forum. There were about 25 people on there, and I weighed in with my superior knowledge about language and said, we never use the word lost, and that's really offensive. And we never say, I'm sorry if you're lost, because that's really offensive and patronizing. And all these people came on, they all came back to me. They were all people whose partners had died, their husbands, their wives had died. And they said, I find that really helpful. Loads of people said to me, I'm sorry for your loss. And I found it really helpful, Jess. It's really nice because it's a code and everybody knows to say it. And it gives people a thing to say when they don't know what else to say. And if people are, then I'm quite comfortable with the term loss because it doesn't mean that in that context. It clearly means he died in that context. So you can't be too literal about the way we use these words either. Do you have anything to say about that, about lost, to lose one?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? It's not a phrase we tend to use. So if we're talking about someone who's died, we will tend to use died. We will sometimes use past, just to, for a little bit of variation sometimes. If, we've said died perhaps too many times in a particular piece, it can feel overloaded. And we tend not to talk about lost. We do talk about loss, which I think is slightly different because it's not implying the person has gone missing in quite the same way. So I think there are interesting phrases. I mean, one we avoid is left behind, which is another one, which I think again can be confusing and not always something that works for everyone. But what we generally find, the person who has died, the person who has passed, those phrases are clear and work for the majority, and I think we are in a slightly different context. And I guess you're talking face to face to individual bereaved people. We're talking to lots of people a bit more remotely. So it's trying to find that thing that is going to work for most, but at the same time isn't going to kind of upset. So I guess it is slightly different. But yeah, we tend to avoid lost because, certainly heard those kinds of reactions. It works for some, it doesn't work for others. And I think that is pretty representative of a lot of language around funerals and why it's so important that we do the research and we keep doing the research and we keep having conversations with different people and learning and evolving. Because as the younger generation start to be planning funerals, they'll be the ones starting to change the language and their takes on these things will be different again.
That is so right. Already, I have learned not to say, I wouldn't anyway, but there's a real move at the moment around gendered language. So one would no longer say ladies and gentlemen, for example. One would always say everyone. I've been asked for a wedding to say folks. So there's an example of the way in which language is evolving. Loss and lost are very different. You're absolutely right. And those two things can be used interchangeably. And there are other words that I'm interested in and the ways in which they're culturally specific. So for a long time, I was part of a church in Birmingham where there were lots of Bayesian people, lots of Jamaican people, mostly women. A lot of them were serial funeral attenders. If you didn't go to a funeral, you were really frowned upon. It was a cultural expectation. And they would talk about he'd passed on, she'd passed on, they had passed on. Because absolutely they believed that they had gone to another place. So for them, the journeying, death was a part of the journeying from one state to another. It wasn't about a death. And I feel that within those contexts, using that language was really important because that was how they spoke about death. I'm there as a white British person who wouldn't talk about death in that way, but there was something really comforting to them about talking about passed away and passed on, and always the rugged cross as well, by the way. Yeah, lost and loss, I hadn't thought about that distinction. And I think passing away, I was so resistant to it, but a lot of the younger people also said to me when they passed away or when they passed, and I don't know why. Well, language is very loaded for everyone, isn't it? And you will always offend someone. So I think the reason why you are going for the majority is obvious. And you can always choose to be offended by whatever you like. But I've always had a bit of a resistance to passed away because of its euphemistic tendency and because of its euphemistic purpose. And I think that comes from the hospice, and that hospice work was in the 90s. And there was a real move at the time away from euphemism, away towards, especially for children, working with children, how confusing that is for children. What do you mean he's passed? Is he past tense? Is he past me? Is he passed on to someone else? So there was a lot of interest and research at the time, lots of academic work looking at how you support children. And children need things to be really clear. They really need it to be about death. And then you need to explain what death is. But there's also things like, what's the other one I was thinking about? Those we see no longer. This is a religious one as well. Those who've died, but whom we see no longer. Have you come across that? And also, can you maybe give us some more examples of euphemisms that people use? I'd be fascinated.
Yeah, I think it is interesting, and you're right to raise the point around cultural and religious needs as well. And I think we always want to create a respectful space for people to have that language when it's important to them. And interesting, one of the sort of projects we've launched alongside our core information is very much around sharing stories of real funerals. And we've been incredibly lucky. Lots of really wonderful people have shared the experiences they've had of planning funerals. And what they look like. And we were chatting about this earlier, I know, but this whole idea of it's huge variety within them and the different things people would have, all sorts of different options. But one of the really nice things about that project and why I think it's so important is those stories are told in those people's own words. And so we've got all this information over here on our site where we've got the core factual information, where we sort of say, okay, what's going to work for the majority of people? And then we've got articles that share these real stories where we show those kind of cultural nuances in language, and I love the fact we've got, we've got a funeral for Mam or a funeral for Papa, and even just like how we refer to the person who's died and our relationship is so personal, and the language they use, and we allow their language to be there as they say it, which I think is really important, is a way of sort of navigating that space sometimes. How can we create a space where people who do use these words can use them in a safe way and see them and feel related to, but at the same time respect that kind of middle ground as well.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Getting people to actually use their own words is brilliant. And you're right about mum and papa and dad. When I was in Birmingham, look, I'm from the south, as you can tell. When I was in Birmingham, everybody spelt mum M-O-M.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I used to check it, or I'd go through it and change it. And they were like, Mom, no, it's Mom. And then when I came back to the south, of course, nobody uses Mom anymore. And it's really, that's such a small, and those of you who are not in the UK will think that's absurd because the UK is tiny. And even within our counties, we have these regional differences about how we talk about our familial relationships. So I think that is lovely that you're getting people to speak in their own words. And what's surprising is, of course, the assumption is that we don't want to talk about our people or our funeral or our death, but you found people were willing in the right way, if you approach them in the right way, not only willing, but pleased to be asked to talk about their person and what they did for their person. So I think that's a really valuable thing for them. I think it's a two-way street. You get to talk about what you did for Dad. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I think so. And I think what's surprised me as well with these stories is some of the stories people have shared have been really quite difficult. It's you might expect people to share, a celebratory funeral that felt quite comfortable. We've had people share stories of funerals of stillbirths. We've had stories where people have died by suicide, for example. We've had all sorts of things, and people have been so incredibly generous in sharing, even in incredibly challenging scenarios where you might think they might not want to share. They have been, and actually, I think for a lot of the people who share the stories, they want other people to know what has happened and how they navigated that and how they plan the funeral that they wanted so that other people in a similar situation go, actually, well, I could do it like this. And I think that, again, is opening that conversation in a way that is comfortable and relatable for people. But yeah, certainly people do want to talk about it. And I think it's, funnily enough, we did some research. We're doing a lot of research. We did some recently, and we asked people, have you thought about your funeral? And I think there's this kind of misconception. We think, well, most people haven't planned it. Most people haven't planned it. But 71% of people have thought about it, even if that's just one thing they want, like they want a song, they know they want that, or they don't want this, or whatever it is, they know they want a particular type of coffin. We are having those conversations, but we're maybe not having them in a big formal way. And that's okay. I think actually that's something really important that we need to acknowledge in the death care industry is you don't have to plan everything. You don't have to have a big conversation. You might have a little bit here, a little bit there. And just having the vocabulary to explore that is what's going to help you to start to think about your options.
For those of you who are not watching this, I'm nodding like madly because of this thing, misconceptions, the way in which all I keep hearing is that we're not talking about death in our country. It's a taboo. Death is a taboo. And I keep thinking, I don't think that's the case. And then I think, is it because this is my space and people open up to me and they say it's a great relief to be able to talk to you in this way? That's partly it, but that's not all of it. Because you can easily hear this. You'll hear this and you will probably notice it now. If you're listening to this now, you'll go out and you'll hear people say, death is a taboo. No one talks about death in our culture. And then you will go on Netflix or iPlayer and you'll see Ricky Gervais doing Afterlife. That amazing. I mean, I haven't watched it, but I know it's really popular. Think about what you're absorbing culturally on Netflix or any kind of platform. There's loads of stuff about death. There's loads of conversations happening. And I love what you said about using your own vocabulary and how it's okay to speak about it in your own way or to the level to which you're comfortable. But that is not the same as people not talking about death in our culture. In my experience, people can't wait to talk about it. And that's either because they feel they're not allowed to in particular parts of their lives or in our culture in general, or it's because I'm a safe person with whom to talk about that. But I don't personally think it's true that death is a taboo in our culture. What's your experience of that? And then I must talk to you about suicide as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think taboo comes up a lot, and I think it's one of the cliches of the industry, actually, isn't it? That actually it's that stock phrase, it's taboo. And yeah, like you, I don't think it is. I think it's how we frame those conversations and how we see those conversations. It's almost like if you haven't got a full documented funeral plan, you're not talking about it. But actually, like you say, most people are. It's happening immediately more and more. And certainly we suspect that kind of some of the interest in living funerals, living wakes, is there's been more of that in the media. There have been various different films and programs showing living wakes as part of that. So I think we do, but maybe we don't give it a death label in a sense, and maybe that's, again, coming back to language. We're more comfortable talking about it rather than saying, I'm thinking about my death and here's what I want for my funeral. It might be, well, thinking actually I'd quite like this song, or I'd quite like to write my own eulogy. Now I know what a eulogy is and now I know that's an option. I think it's understanding that it might not be a big conversation. It might just be a really small moment threaded in among other things, and that's natural, that's normal. I think is a really important part of it.
Yeah, and I think we need to stop judging our culture because we don't do that. And I mean, we could be here forever. And there's all of that. There's this film called Love at First Sight, which is on Netflix. If you like rom-coms, I actually did not enjoy the film, but there is a thing about living wakes in it. And if you're a bit of an old romantic, you'll love that. And then you just came up with another word then that I'm really thinking, yeah, that's another one. People always saying, I don't want a funeral. I'm not having a funeral. Put me out with the bins. There's a lot of that. But there was another thing you said then that, it's gone. It might come back to me in a minute. Very briefly, let's talk a little bit about the word suicide, and then I'll ask you a few more questions, but I'm aware that I've had a lot of your time, and we're probably going to have to do this again. We'll have a part.
Absolutely.
Because there's just too many things, and I'll be going away writing notes, and there's that and that and that, because it's a huge topic, isn't it? And there's so many things around, do you know what I mean? Around like afterlife even. people talking about robins. Nan came to see me today, and I want to speak to a folklore specialist because I heard someone on Radio 4 years ago talking about it, about the idea of the robin and how the robin comes to visit us afterwards and it's the spirit of our dead. There are so many conversations to be had here, and I think maybe when we meet again, we'll talk about angels, about the ways in which people actually do have a belief about something afterwards, but it's not traditional, and also religious terms, eulogy, for example. That's a whole other thing, and we don't have time, but I'd love to get into that if you're willing to come back.
Absolutely, yeah.
I hope you will. Suicide. So one of my things is that I have had a lot of people come to me with what we would traditionally term suicide. And mum or dad will call and say, I don't know whether you work with tragic deaths, but it's complicated. No one ever says, my son died from suicide. They will just say, they will open with, it's complicated. And I know what that means and I know what that code is. But maybe we will have to have another episode about suicide, because for those of you who don't know or have never really thought about it, suicide is actually, apparently, it's still considered a crime in our culture. And then when you think about homicide or genocide, the side bit is the killing. And traditionally, it was considered a sin by the church, suicide, to kill oneself. And I have a real problem with it as a word, because I know its origins, the etymology of it. I've spent a lot of time living with that word, thinking about what that does to people. So I started using the term took his own life, took her own life, took their own life, because that felt like a thing where it was quite empowered for the person who had done that thing. They'd made a choice and they had taken that choice and they had taken their life, and it felt less savage than this idea of killing. So that was one of the ways in which I approached it. And then I recently had a conversation with this brilliant woman called Melanie Wilson in New York, and she used the term death of despair. And in the States, that's used to relate to people who've died from addictions. But I loved it because it does strike me as true. 9 times out of 10, if you are someone who's taken your own life, it is because you are in despair. And I like that it takes away the judgment and it gives you back a sense of the sadness of that. And the reason why a person might have taken that decision isn't to be cruel to the people that they love. It's to just save themselves from a moment of trauma. So I'm aware that I don't like the term suicide for all of those reasons, but for all, and this is really wrapping it up really quite nicely, for all of the reasons that we've discussed, this is a word in common parlance. For most people, it doesn't mean that, because why would they know that? It's what we say, it's code, it's a way in which we talk about a terrible thing that happened without saying how it happened, and everybody knows what it means. So I think I've been a little bit snooty about that word, and I wondered how you approach it in your work.
Yeah, I think, lots to think about there in terms of what you said. I think, died by despair it feels emotionally comfortable. But certainly for us, we use died by suicide. We don't say committed suicide because, like you say, that's got the associations with it being a crime. So we say died by suicide, and we use it because it is in common parlance. It is what people understand. It also, for us, a lot of people will come to us because they've done a search online, and actually that is what they're typing in right now. Over time, that may well change. We may see new terminology come through that becomes more searched, but we're not much help to people if they can't find us. So we have to use those words that they use when they're searching. And, we're lucky enough to have that data to be able to see what people are searching. So I think for us, that's a big part of the reason we use that. But I think it is one of those, even within the subject matter we're talking about, one of the most sensitive areas. And I think a lot of it comes down to how the family feel about things, doesn't it? And each family is going to feel different about that experience of that person and them dying by suicide, and what that means to them. I think it's challenging, but that's certainly how we approach it, is let's use the clearest language possible.
And I like the died by, that really works. There's a whole topic around trauma that we haven't got onto, and we've run out of time, But I do want to ask you a few more of my questions, and they're just around your own personal experience of ceremony. So have you had any ceremony where you've really regretted not doing a thing or regretted doing a thing with the ceremonies in your own life?
Yeah, do you know, I thought about this earlier, and you've made me realize something about myself I'd never thought about before. So actually, I'm a ceremony avoider when it comes to my own personal ceremonies. So I'm not married, I don't have children, so I've never done the christening thing. And although I have 2 degrees, I didn't attend either of my degree ceremonies purposely. So it's quite interesting, and it got me thinking about why do I do that, and how have I, as someone who avoids ceremonies, chosen to go into spending all my time writing information and creating content to support people to plan ceremonies. And I think it comes down to really, I think, what we were saying earlier, you know, if I go back to that funeral that I went to that was not a good experience, you know, perhaps when I was younger, not realizing how flexible things can be and how you can do things on your own terms. And I think that as I've gotten older, realizing that you can, is probably where I'm at now, and actually thinking, you know, maybe one day I will do a ceremony. I mean, certainly one day I will, for certain. There's one coming right at the end, isn't there? But I think, you know, in the interim, maybe I will. You know, now I know I can do things on my own terms. But I think it's interesting, and I think it's that idea of perhaps having that false expectation that ceremony means traditional, as opposed to ceremony means whatever you want it to be and how you want it to look, and actually shape it that way and make it work for you.
So that kind of covers ideas around what you might wish you had done, perhaps, or yeah.
I mean, not so much wish I had done, but I guess just that acknowledgement of knowing that I can do things the way I want to in the future just opens that possibility up a bit more, I think, doesn't it?
Yeah. And is there anything that you wish you had done that you didn't do, like for people that have died in your life or anything like that?
Oh gosh, I'm trying to think now. I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
It's quite a tricky one, that.
Yeah.
I just thought of another word, which is ceremony. So I'm reading a book about ritual now. And in that book, ceremony doesn't get mentioned very much, but ritual is ceremony, and it could be synonymous. I don't know, but that's a whole other thing. And finally, what are you hopeful for? What makes you hopeful for human beings? I like to do this one because I feel like I want opening ceremony to be a hopeful space, a humanizing space. And I think fundamental to human life is to foster hope. So I just wondered, if that's the bins being emptied, whether you had any hope for human beings.
Of course, yeah. Thank goodness I do. Yeah, I think actually, you know, for me, working in the death care space actually strangely gives me a lot of hope. I think, you know, when you're outside of it, your expectation might be that everyone's a bit serious, a bit somber, it's a bit scary. But actually, what I would say is that funeral directors, celebrants, grief counsellors are some of the most inspiring people I've ever met. You know, the empathy, the kindness, the compassion, and the commitment to helping others at a really difficult time. And I think just knowing there are people who will do that, because let's face it, most of us couldn't be a funeral director, most of us couldn't be a celebrant, but seeing people who are brave enough, generous enough to do that, I think gives me a huge amount of hope. You know, in terms of humanity, we've still got humanity.
We've still got humanity, and one of the things that ceremony does is remind us that we're human. That's a great answer. I love that answer. I recently did a live with my coffin club pal. We recently wrote a thing about eulogies, didn't we, for you? So you could, those of you who are listening, I'm just going to get Amy to say where you can find her and find out about funeral choice. And you'll also see some stuff that we've written on there. So that's a nice little collaboration that we've got going. So Amy, tell everybody where they can find you and find Funeral Choice.
Yeah, of course. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm easy to find, Amy Dugmore. And you can find Funeral Choice at www.yourfuneralchoice.com, where you'll find all the information and all the funeral directors as well.
Amazing. I've really taken so much of your time, which is really naughty, but I don't regret it because you're brilliant. That's it for today, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. I think I'm supposed to say things like and subscribe and all those fancy things. It's kind of hard to work out how to do it, but if you can work out how to like and subscribe, that would be great. And before we know it, we'll be at the top of the New York Times bestseller or whatever they're called. So make sure you follow us, and do check out Funeral Choice, because it's really quite an incredible thing, and I'm thrilled to be associated with it. And bye for now.
Bye.